Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Cucaruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. John and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Jim.
Welcome to another episode of Connecting with Conservation. I'm your co-host, John Gassett with the Wildlife Management Institute. I'm here with my fellow co-host, Jim Cucaruto. Jim?
All right. This is another good Connecting with Conservation podcast. We keep outdoing ourselves. So today we got another great guest from another great industry that's connected to conservation that we'll get into. So CJ, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal interests, and then we'll get into the business of knives.
Fair enough. I'm CJ Buck. My family's been making outdoor sports cutlery for close to 123 years. And so I'm fourth generation to run our business. My son's also involved, so that's the fifth generation. And he just had the sixth generation, my grandson Walter, who's not quite a year old, or just over a year old. So we're bringing him up properly. I have been involved from a conservation element, kind of growing up in the hunting community, which we can chat about a bit, but, growing up in that community and now just trying to give a little back, trying to get involved, a little more of a leadership element, not just a checkbook, but actually get involved in the conservation policies and et cetera. So I'm very passionate about it.
So, CJ, I like that term, outdoor sports cutlery. If I'd known that when I was a kid in school, it got me out of a lot of trouble, I think. It's like, yeah, you have a knife. No, this is outdoor sports cutlery. It's not a knife. Of course, that was back when they just take it away from you and give it back to you at the end of the day. Now you get suspended or expelled or whatever. So
I remember being in the 10th grade in high school, and up until that point, knives were perfectly legal at school. So that was the year they became illegal.
Yeah, it's, we all probably grew up and our, Levi's or Lee jeans had in your back pocket, had the imprint of a knife. And then, mom had to put a patch on there sometimes because you just carried that every day. And well, while we're on the topic there, so, I've been to John's house and you're not within a step of a knife. That guy's got more knives, but I think I got somebody that might have more knives than John. So CJ, you probably had an EDC in diapers. So what's your favorite knife to carry?
You know what? It varies, but, everyday carry, I'll differentiate. So, everyday carry, a friend of mine, Sal Glasser, who created Spyderco knives, he kind of popularized a one-hand operation pocket clip concept. And that's my favorite concept to carry. So I'm into nylon or carbon fiber, lightweight handles, not really shiny, not into a lot of metal, so you can drop them around and scratch them up and use them hard. I'm very much a knife user. I am not a knife collector. So everyday carry is a good steel, lightweight pocket clip. And then from a hunting standpoint, I can't stand to have anything on my belt when I'm hunting. So usually it's a fixed blade backpack.
So you mentioned the steel, and I'm not just saying this because you're our guest, but a buck knife was the first real knife I had, and it was a fixed blade hunter that for my mom and dad got me for deer hunting. And I was probably 8 years old. I had other little knives prior to them, but that was a real knife, and the thing I noticed about it almost immediately is it was incredibly hard to sharpen because the steel is so hard. But once you get it sharp, it stays sharp for a long time. I've never met another knife that has the quality of the steel that I find in a buck knife.
from a steel standpoint, so there's numerous new steels. I have to give credit to the custom knife industry, who has a little more freedom in being experimental, versus one of us as a higher volume production facility. We have to be a little more careful with what we experiment with. But the custom knife crews, I'll tell you a little bit about steels if I might. But usually with a knife steel, you're balancing three different attributes. You're balancing ductility, so soft enough to be ductile, hard enough to hold an edge, and then whatever corrosion resistance you can get. So you're balancing those three. It's got to be hard but soft and not corrode. So that's what you're always balancing. And usually you get to pick any two. You don't get to pick all three. You get to pick any. It can be soft and stainless and won't hold an edge worth a darn. It can be hard, hold an amazing edge, but you look at water and it'll rust. So you're always balancing those. So some of the new steels are allowing you to optimize some element of all three, and that's what the new steels are doing. And so that's the element of the steel. The other big piece of that is how well you heat treat it. So what's happening in heat treat is you're taking the atomic elements that are within the steel, almost like a cake batter, and as you cook it, you are connecting those elements. So you're creating new molecules using heat, using cold. You are creating new molecules that perform differently than the elements did separately. And so as you create these new molecules, if you do your heat treat right, you create as many connections as possible. And so even when we're using the same steel as someone else, our steel is better because we just heat treat it more carefully.
Gotcha. So I know you said, there's a lot we can get into on the technical side of building knives and all that stuff, but you start off saying you have a real personal interest in conservation, and I know you're heavily involved with some conservation organizations. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your work with those organizations and what's kind of current on the list of conservation topics for you?
Okay. Well, I've been involved with the Boone and Crockett Club. So I'm speaking all for myself today. I'm not speaking for the club at all, but I've been a regular member of the Boone and Crockett Club since 2011, and really, really enjoy that. And I'll come back to the club, and then the other thing I got very involved with was the Mule Deer Foundation. So, we've been involved and donating to NRA, Elk Foundation, Turkey Federation. We've been involved with all of them, but the mule deer, for me, growing up out here in the West, the mule deer for me was a giant piece. And mule deer recovery just doesn't seem to be happening at the same pace as other large game species. So it was an opportunity to try and get a little bit behind the curtain a bit, bring in a little, maybe, because there's the wildlife biologists are there, but sometimes just the problem solving that's more of a business approach is sometimes really helpful. And when you get somebody like me who doesn't really know anything to start with, you're starting from scratch, and sometimes the avenues you end up walking down, you would not have gotten from somebody who'd been there too long. So it was an opportunity to kind of get involved. Like with mule deer, it was migration corridors, and it wasn't as much habitat as it was other impacts that were impacting. I mean, it was neighborhoods and car crashes and migratory upsetting that, or it was invasive species like whitetail. It was just, there were so many other elements involved that I just found fascinating. And so then that kind of rolled into, it was the involvement with mule deer that kind of rolled me. It was meeting Miles Moretti, but it was that got me involved with the Boone and Crockett Club, which is now not being critter specific, just kind of gave a much broader opportunity to look at what's working in conservation, what's not working, how to highlight how critical hunting is to wildlife management. And as a nation, we really don't have an alternative to hunting right now. There's nothing more flexible, self-funding, self-policing. I mean, it can flex down to a county. So there we are as an entire nation with this system that we can turn it on, turn it off. Like, it's so amazingly effective and has the history, the success, the performance metrics to prove it. Anyway, so that's been growing up in the industry, growing up making knives, growing up listening to outdoor stories, where knives saved their life, or were such a part of their hunting initiation, their relationship with their grandfather. I mean, it was just so many cool stories.
You mentioned the biologist, and I can dig on those a little bit because I am one by training. I found that most biologists go into wildlife biology because they really don't like people much. They like dealing with the critters, and they really don't think about the business part for the most part. It's really the science around the animal, and that does sort of create some tunnel vision. And I encourage mine that when I ran an agency, to my biologist, I said, you got to think bigger than just the biology of the animal and its needs. You got to think about the user groups that want access to it. You got to think about the corridors, and how do you deal with that when they're crossing highways where people are driving, or fences where farmers are keeping cattle in, or whatever. So I almost feel like anytime there's a biological team, but there ought to be a business mind inserted in there just to say, okay, folks, let's think of it from a different direction. So,
I will say from a business standpoint, you have no authority over the people you are trying to influence. And so it really kind of forces you to come from a persuasion element, not an authoritarian element. And so that's why I think business minds are so important in some of these groups, because people get tangled up in forcing things when, a little incentive, like, try to sweep water downhill. Don't try to sweep water uphill. And that's a business mentality, which I think on a federal level we're seeing quite obviously right now is just bringing in that business mentality and stop fighting gravity. Just use it. Gravity can be your friend. Use it properly.
Yeah, John had alluded to it. We've had conversations about wildlife biologists are better at talking to the animals than they are the people, right? So, and CJ, you and I had a recent conversation about this. Not only do we have to, preach to the choir, other hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters, but it's really becoming more and more important to speak outside to the general population about the benefits and all the positive contributions that the industry and hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters make to, improve wildlife populations and fund conservation and clean up the environment and feed ourselves and our family and donate, game meat to feed others. So, why don't you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, but on when you have a system that has created enormous success, it seems really foolhardy to me to tweak that system. Like, it's been amazingly successful. So we've gone from, say, the turn of the century, so let's just say the last 120 years, wildlife populations have come back so well. And if you think about the environment that's happening within, I don't have any numbers, so I'm just pulling numbers out of the air, but let's just say 40 to 50% of the wild spaces that existed in the early 1900s are now residential areas. And so people are encroaching into these places. So these places are more isolated. They're not a contiguous giant wilderness anymore. So if you decimate a population in an area, you don't have the surrounding environment to just come in and reseed that area. These are kind of isolated gardens that need to be managed in a much different way. You can't leave it up to Mother Nature because, Mother Nature manages with a sledgehammer. And and sometimes you need a scalpel. And mankind, we tend to be able to manage much more finely than waiting for disease or starvation or something to just decimate an area. And who wants to live in the area that just got denuded of wildlife and waiting the 50 years for it to come back? Like, man, I'd rather manage it at its peak and enjoy it while I'm here. And anyway, so that's how in looking at managing hunting, the flexibility, just when you sit back and think about it, the flexibility of adding more tags, shutting down a season, like just that flexibility where an entire state doesn't have to do something. It might just be a county or a couple contiguous counties. Like you've got this amazing flexibility. You can add more tags. You can take tags off. You can close the season. You can put antler restrictions on. You can do like all these different things you can do to fine tune. I was joking with, I don't remember who I was talking to, but it was, wouldn't you rather have a heater system in your house that had a dial and not just an on and off switch? Like, wouldn't you want to be able to, I want it to be 72 degrees. I want it to be 68 degrees. I don't want on and off. Hunting is that dial. It's got all that flexibility baked into it. And Mother Nature's the on and off switch. And so I listen to these people talk that have no knowledge of just how devastating just allowing something to take place versus managing it.
And a good example of that, I've used that word exactly, is people got to be flexible when they're managing wildlife because they're by definition are not contained. They're not in a zoo, so they got to be flexible. But the other word I love is adaptable. And think about mule deer. A dozen years ago, we had no idea that mule deer migrated the distances they did. So we had one way of managing them. And then all of a sudden, we got new research that's showing they're migrating 300-400 miles in some cases, which is a whole different type of animal. Now it's more like an elk migrating, with snow. So they had to adapt to a new, a changing system. And, I think the folks that are managers that don't do that don't make it as managers very long because, they don't see successes in their programs.
Well, you look at some of those older programs where, like with the ducks and the migration of waterfowl and how that goes well beyond national boundaries. And we were just, until that, you're right, you can't manage it properly.
An interesting kind of biological history lesson is we put off the restoration of wild turkeys for probably 20 years after they were almost extirpated. And the reason why was the only remnant populations were in big, huge, coastal plain swamps in the deep south. So they thought, well, that's the only place turkeys like to live. So we got limited amount of swamps, so we can't. What they didn't realize until 20 years later was turkeys will live anywhere. They were just relegated to that because we'd shot them everywhere else. We had, unregulated, hunting had taken them. So once again, an assumption that was false that caused a 20-year delay in moving turkeys. Once they finally figured out, hey, they'll live in the uplands, they'll live in fields, they'll live in pine stands, they don't care. Then, turkey, well, now we have turkeys everywhere. But for 20 years, we sat on our hands and decided we just probably wouldn't get turkeys back because we didn't have enough habitat to support them.
So I know, one of the joys that I have, and, one of the things that John works on at WMI, and one of the things that Outdoor Stewards works on is trying to expand participation in hunting and fishing and trapping and target shooting. And we had always thought that, youth was the key and it would just, happen naturally. But then we saw a big downturn in hunting, a decade ago, and, folks were aging out and not replacing themselves. So I think at least the first time that I'm aware of the industry that got involved in recruitment, and state agencies have been working on this for a while, was a program that actually Buck Knives was heavily involved in. And NSSF, when I worked at NSSF, we partnered with Union Sportsmen's Alliance and came up with a program called Mentoring Rewarded, where we knew through the research that all you need to do is provide three things: an information on how to get started, an invitation, and an incentive. And the incentive was, a buck knife. I think we ended up buying like 1,000 buck knives or something like that, working with Union Sportsman's Alliance. And I dug through my folder of stuff. NSSF, USA, and I don't know what number knife this is. If you can probably recall better than I can what we did here, but these things worked like gold for us because Union Sportsman's Alliance, they work with basically people that have to be an apprentice, so they know the mentoring system, and sent out messages to their members saying, hey, if you introduce somebody new to hunting or target shooting or gun safety, we'll provide you with this knife, and we got tons and tons of people that just sent in their stories. They were so proud of doing it. So I appreciate you helping out with that. But, are you still looking to, get people outdoors yourself?
Oh yeah, no, that's just always. I will say, just referencing back to just a few years, COVID was an enormous benefit to getting people outdoors, because you were disincentivized to crowd together. So getting out into open spaces was a real open invitation, and I don't know how much of that stuck. Like so people who were introduced to getting outdoors for the first time, if they got it out of their system and went back to urban piling on each other, or if they're still enjoying getting out into the outdoors. Me personally, so our company was in San Diego, California, and we relocated our business from San Diego to Post Falls, Idaho, a little community in between Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Spokane, Washington. So we're right there on the Idaho-Washington border, and so you can see elk from my office window. You can see Visa geese flying overhead. So I'll sit in here with all my nose prints on the window as I'm watching wildlife outside. But just I can't imagine not being in a more open wildlife environment. I find it so soothing for myself to go home to nothing but the sound of a little creek running by the house, and watching all the named deer in the backyard that I'm not allowed to touch. But anyway, getting people outdoors is still a big interest for us, of just constantly reminding people. The advertising we do, try to show messages. It's more in the picture yourself in this picture kind of an opportunity, and just plant that seed, inspire people to get outdoors. There's so much non-reality going on in the world today. It really is nice to get outdoors and see real life for a little while.
Yeah, there's not much better than you'll get the same reaction the time somebody catches their first fish. It's the turn around and smile. The time they hit their first target or bust their first clay, turn around and smile, and it makes you feel great. I mean, better than you busting your 1,000th clay or catching your 1,000th bass, and then somebody harvests their first animal and cooks their first meal, and you can just be part of that. I mean, there's not much better than that. So one of the things we try to do, we've got a program that kind of morphed out of that mentoring rewarded called Come With, where we introduce people, say, hey, if you're a current participant, invite somebody new, man. It's such a good feeling for yourself, but it also helps replace yourself and then help refund conservation, because we know all those licenses and all the products they buy from, guns and ammo, bows, arrows, and rod drills and lures, and even supporting companies like Buck Knives, where you're giving back to conservation organizations. It's a big, a lot of people involved in conservation, but they're pretty much all focused on living a lifestyle. Outside of our lifestyle, there's not organizations or taxes that fund conservation other than people that participate.
I did have another thought though, and that's, CJ, we, connecting with conservation is really about the business of conservation. And of course, you've already touched on the business aspect, but But it's really about how we pay for all this work that the biologists and the other managers do. And of course, you've got the license, revenue stream, and you got the excise tax, and we tend to delve quite frequently into what we call funding excise tax adjacent or funding adjacent businesses like Buck Knives. You don't, there's no excise tax on knives for conservation, but y'all donating knives or selling knives at a discount to conservation organizations to use as incentives to re-up a membership. I re-up memberships that I don't even want to be a member of, because if there's a buck knife involved, I'm like, I'll do it just to get the knife, and it keeps me engaged. It keeps a lot of people engaged. And of course, so it helps keep people front and center and focused on conservation. And of course, when they're doing, when they're participating there, they're giving money to groups like DU or turkeys or whoever, which goes back to the ground for wildlife and habitats. But it's also an essential, part of your hunting gear. You don't go hunting with a rifle or a bow and not have a knife. Or if you do, you're not very optimistic you're going to have any success. I'll say that. But, so we do like to recognize it and think, companies who, while they may be outside the excise tax system or the license stream, they're still an integral part of conservation. And I think that starts at the top with folks like you that have a conservation ethic. And you mentioned the Boone and Crockett Club, and that's what, that's really, if I had to describe it in 2 words, it's conservation ethic. That's what they do. So we're glad that you have taken the company for many years in that direction, because there are tons of knife makers out there, and many of them aren't connected to this conservation model that we know and love. So just want to make that point that it's we do try to talk about how the money comes into conservation to directly pay for the things we have to do, but there's a ton of a whole network of businesses out there that are driving that same machine. So we just want to let you know we appreciate that.
Well, I will say, when it is a bit of a religion for us. You got multiple generations that you're representing. So it's way more than just a product. The company is way more than just a corporate piece on a playing board. It really is a bit of a family religion, of which our Christianity does play a role in that, as just being part of our family. But
at least on the box that I had here, it said "Made in America." You're still making them in America, and
oh yeah,
and I follow your website, and I get your emails, and I'm a sucker for your knife of the month. I bought a couple of your knife of the months here, and that's currently my everyday carry.
Oh, there we go.
But
the Marksman, that's one of my favorites right there.
Yeah, like you say, lightweight, and it's got some use on it, and keeps an edge. But so why don't you tell us a little bit about what's new, what kind of products are new, and where where you're going next with the knife market.
Well, we talked a little bit about steel. So as I mentioned, we're very careful. We don't bounce around to different steels, because it takes us years to figure out, to get enough use, to get enough feedback from customers. Where are we heat treating these steels properly? Are they delivering like we say they're going to? So we don't jump around very often. So there are a couple of new steels. There's a powdered metal technology. So instead of doing thousands of pounds in a melt, and hoping that all the elements that you added into that steel get mixed up properly and homogeneously divided throughout, spread throughout that entire melt. When you're only taking a few ounces and making a knife blade out of it, you don't want to have that little piece be devoid of all the good knife material in there, which is possible. So the new technology is doing these much smaller, maybe in the hundreds of pounds, not thousands of pounds, and or not tons, but just in these small batches where you're using powder, you get a good mix, then you melt it, coin it, we laser cut it, we make knives out of it, but you just get a much more consistent part. And from a manufacturing standpoint, the consistency is what you want. You want the tooling that you use to not create a lot of variation. You want every knife to perform just like it's supposed to, what we try and do.
Well, I appreciate everything you've done. I've been a long time customer, and I'm sure I'll gonna, next time I see an email, I'm gonna be like, oh, okay, might be time to buy another one. But I definitely want to thank you for all you've done for conservation personally and business wise, and the support you've given me throughout my career with that starting off the first ever reward and mentoring program, really, that got the industry going on that. Just one more time, is there a website and social media where people can go to figure out what's next with you guys or
Oh
follow
yeah.
you guys?
No, we've got the www.buckknives.com. We do. You mentioned the buck of the month. So we do these little projects, and they're just kind of fun. And it could be 250 or 500. It's fairly small runs, something unique, a unique handle material or a unique theme, and we just kind of have fun with it. But yeah, we have there's information about how to sharpen, about different steels, all of the models that we make. We try and work through why, like we try and share the intent behind this design is this is a little heavier, that's a little lighter. This is one hand operation. This is not. This is a fixed blade, carry it in a sheath. This one is just like a Kydex blade cover. So we try and go through and share that intent with someone. So somebody who's trying to figure out, what knife they should buy. Those are fun conversations to have with people. How you want to carry it? What are you going to do with it? I really enjoy helping someone, figure out what their best carry is going to be. And in fact, I'll be at the, coming up. I like doing the consumer shows, so I'll be at the Western Hunting Conservation Expo in Salt Lake City. I'll be at the NRA show in Atlanta this year. But the opportunity to interact directly with customers and have those conversations, I just think are they're just too much fun. So I thoroughly enjoy them.
Well, CJ, thank you for coming on, and thank you for continuing to infuse that conservation ethic in your business, your family's business, because that is the most important part. It's not just about a product; it's about a way of life. And we really appreciate that. I do have one last question for you before we let you go. Whetstone or diamond hone? What do you use?
Diamond. So I'm a medium grit diamond person. I don't have the patience for anything else.
I still like the old Arkansas whetstone, but I did find that a diamond hone sharpens a buck a lot quicker.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It may not be quite as sharp. Those Arkansas stones are pretty amazing, but I just don't have the patience for that. I need to be cutting.
Yeah, I got you. Well, thank you for being on the show. It's been a pleasure. Keep up the good work. Keep doing good things for conservation. And to our listeners, listen to this episode and some of our others. Subscribe if you would. That always helps us, and you'll get notifications as new episodes drop. And with that, we'll see you in the woods or on the water.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.